as Jeff mentioned, right now I'm working as the senior engineering manager at Gatsby, but previously jack of all trades, master of none at Manifold. So really enjoyed my time working in Halifax and looking forward to chatting with y'all. I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership, and I think this has a little bit of something for everyone, whether you're a leader on your team and want to help out your reports or your teammates, or if you're kind of looking for ways to level yourself up. So all of that being said, I will start sharing. Here we go. So the title of my talk being Leadership 101, How to Turn Junior into Senior. And you're probably thinking, well, what's all that about? First, let's talk about, have you ever wanted a promotion? I think that's probably something that everybody here has thought about in some capacity at some point. And so let's talk about what it means to be a senior engineer or a more senior member of an engineering team. First of all, I think the titles junior and senior and many of the other terms that we use to describe engineering roles, they're pretty ambiguous and they mean different things at different companies. So the skill sets for each title that you might come across vary a lot, but leadership skills are incredibly valuable at any level, and they'll help you make that next career move when you're ready. So for now, we'll focus on what leadership skills look like and put aside how the terms junior and senior might not accurately reflect one's abilities. So if you have your eye on a new title or you're a manager who wants to help your reports achieve their goals, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Can everybody see my slides okay?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so there's a really good article that I like called On Being a Senior Engineer, which was written by John Alspaugh. He's the former CTO of Etsy, and he captures what I'd like to talk about pretty succinctly. He says, I expect a senior engineer to be a mature engineer. In other words, one who has characteristics and abilities that can have a positive influence on an organization that aren't just technical. In my opinion, these can generally be bucketed into one of four groups, and those are communication, the ability to plan, empathy, and understanding and focus on product concerns within your company. So the first of these groups is communication. Leaders in our engineering organizations have to be strong communicators, both written and verbal, who can influence decision-making in various contexts. And you can probably think of those types of decision-making on your team, whether it's to pursue a particular project or what that implementation would look like, or a whole host of other things. And for communication, this can manifest in a few ways. Engineers should be able to document their work. It could be a technical architecture diagram, a postmortem relating to an outage, a decision record of some implementation that was done, or a document explaining the team's release process or something similar. The next is the ability to share context. Engineers, especially when they've been with a company for a long time and have built up technical or business context over time, will need to be able to communicate that knowledge with other engineers in order to enable the team to understand new work and to be able to distribute that work amongst the team. And then lastly, the ability to spec out projects is critical. And this will often mean taking the result of some design and product discovery and producing documentation that can be consumed by other people that outlines one or more possible paths for shipping a specific deliverable. So here's an implementation that might take longer, here's one that's faster but has some technical trade-offs, all sorts of things of that nature. Another thing that more senior engineers need to be able to do is planning. The ability to plan is critical. Proper planning allows individual knowledge to be compiled in such a way that anyone from the team can execute a piece of work. And the process of planning helps folks on the team start to see patterns in how long certain activities will take or how projects can be approached. One critical part of planning is anticipating roadblocks. Based on an engineer's understanding of a project, what are the possible technical obstacles that the team might need to overcome? Are there multiple ways to mitigate those, or is there only one? This requires solid knowledge of the product and the code base and the ability to think about those two things and how they relate at a high level. Then at a more granular level, planning also encompasses breaking down work into a clearly scoped set of small deliverables with as few dependencies as possible. Breaking down work is a skill that requires a lot of practice. I can clearly remember the first project I wrote tickets for myself, and my understanding of the dependencies and how to sequence each piece was weak. And the outcome for the project might not have been great, but for me, I learned how to do a better job of that in the future. It's important to note that, like with anything, all the skills we'll talk about are ones that might feel difficult or clunky at first. You might make mistakes, things might not go exactly the way you want, but learning is the most important part of that, and they become second nature with practice. And the last aspect of planning that I'll talk about that's really important in a more senior engineer is estimation, which happens both at the project level and the task level. It's important for engineers to be able to estimate the level of effort of a whole project. Is this something that'll take days, weeks, or months? And knowing that level of effort can be critical in determining when work should be done. Estimation is also important in the context of small, well-scoped issues, JIRA tickets, stories, and those would be measured in hours or fractions of days. If a team has a collection of accurately estimated tasks, it's really easy to do that quick math and understand exactly when a milestone will be hit or something will be able to be shipped and communicated to users. And then any leader, of course, needs to embody empathy. They should strive to understand the feelings and motivations of their coworkers and help them however they can. And a key point of that is that as part of having empathy, engineers should be giving useful feedback. That means not only giving feedback, but making sure it's clear, actionable, and kind. Now, of course, kindness doesn't mean not telling somebody when they've missed something or if they should take a different approach, but it does mean considering the other person's perspective and making it clear that the feedback isn't personal, that it's for their benefit, that it's for the good of the team. Leaders should also seek input from others at every level. No one's ever going to have all the answers or be able to look at a problem from every angle. When seeking input, an engineer should have a clear ask, and just as they should be able to give good feedback, they need to receive feedback and input with grace and be open to new ideas. Being married to your own ideas, thinking that your ideas are the best is not the mark of a great leader. And lastly, senior engineers should look to provide mentorship to others. That's a skill that takes practice and one that can cover both technical and non-technical areas like we're talking about right now. A senior engineer might provide technical advice and pairing, or they might work with other engineers to show them exactly the types of things we're talking about right now. And then the last bucket of things that at least I personally would expect out of a more senior role is product focus. Leaders should have a deep understanding of the product they're building, no matter what type of organization they work for. It might be a consultancy that's building new projects all the time, or a product organization that is trying to bring new and exciting value to an existing product. Understanding the why of what you're building and who it's for leads to better, more valuable software. So engineers should have empathy for the customer. They should think about the use cases and seek out validation of their ideas by participating in activities like user interviews and data analysis. Then when thinking about implementation, good leaders should make trade-offs explicit. They should know how different technical obstacles might impact what's being shipped. Will it affect the design or the user experience? And is that solution acceptable? So we talked a lot about the what. What can we expect as quote unquote soft skills from our leaders? Now we'll dive into the how. And my hypothesis is that many of those senior engineering skills that I just outlined are critical parts of Agile practices that most organizations follow, regardless of whether they're following a Kanban or a Scrum process. So first, what are engineering processes that contribute to delivering software in an Agile way? And then how can they relate to the groups of skills that we just talked about? How can Agile or team process help you level up in your career? So taking a step back, what is Agile? Atlassian has some really good resources, and they describe it as an iterative approach to project management that helps teams deliver value to their customers faster and with fewer headaches. Requirements, plans, and results are evaluated continuously, so teams have a natural mechanism for responding to change quickly. That last part is really critical. So many teams, at least at smaller companies, don't have dedicated Agile coaches or Agile professionals. And even when they do, they're probably more of an advisor rather than tackling certain aspects of software development hands-on. And that means there's lots of opportunities for individual engineers to use Agile to their advantage to hone these skills and be seen as a leader on their teams. Agile encourages or really requires planning, communication, and more to be successful. So we'll talk through some common phases of a project, how they play into Agile, and then tie them back to our 4 skill buckets that we talked about earlier. So when we think about the delivery lifecycle, often our first phase is discovery. What are we building? Why are we building it? It's really useful to any organization to have an engineer involved at this stage, and it's beneficial to them too. So going through our skill buckets, being involved in the discovery phase hones important communication skills. Engineers might do something like creating documentation, describing the feature, and they'll spend plenty of the time that they dedicated to this discovery sharing context. They'll need to gain context from product owners and designers, and they'll share context that they have, which is often technical in nature, that might influence product decisions. And that's where we also see the great planning skill of anticipating roadblocks. If building a particular feature requires a large-scale technical overhaul, that's a great thing to know in advance. It's going to affect when it ships, it's going to affect how it ships. It's even better to know if there are alternative approaches. While thinking this through, an engineer might also give some thought to the high-level estimation we previously discussed. Would this effort be measured in days, weeks, or months? When can we expect to get it into users' hands? And engineers involved with discovery will also have to have empathy for folks who are in different roles than they're in. What is the motivation of the product owner or the designer? And what are their most important considerations? They're going to be the most useful in this context if they're able to understand those positions. And lastly, it's pretty obvious that a product focus is critical in this phase. Having empathy for the customer will help engineers give feedback that's not purely technical, but also considers the user's needs. And the roadblocks we talked about will come up here as well, as the team considers various approaches and their potential impact on the user experience. In the next phase of planning, we're going to get a little bit more concrete. The team will often need a design document explaining what needs to happen at a high level in order to build whatever we're building. Again, this is another place where an engineer might have the chance to practice some important skills. This sort of technical documentation, excuse me, is another excellent form of context sharing. This time the engineer needs to communicate differently. Instead of explaining technical details in a way that they can guide product decisions, they need to be able to explain the product context while putting the primary focus on the technical implementation details and possible trade-offs. A technical design document could include, for example, an explanation of the expected phases of development. Other engineers will then have a detailed spec to follow during further planning and implementation. It's useful to have the author seek input by presenting their documentation for feedback from others. Again, different perspectives are always valuable in uncovering important information. And I know from when I did this, people would often notice things that I didn't. One perspective is never going to be all you need. Once the what and the how are understood at a high level, it's important to have a well-scoped set of tasks that a team can pick up and implement. Writing stories is one of the parts of Agile software development that is very much underappreciated. A well-written set of tasks can be critical in determining the order in which work should be done to minimize dependencies, and it'll allow the team to ship value faster. Stories and issues also provide a record of what work was done and why, which is incredibly helpful when bugs or scope changes inevitably surface later. Why did we do this thing? What were the inputs we considered when making a decision? The practice of writing stories is another activity that heavily depends on excellent context sharing, stories that explain what is being done and why, and then also include necessary technical details or restrictions, and link back to design artifacts or other documentation, make implementation that much easier. It reduces those iterative cycles of folks asking questions, having to get clarification. The more information that's there and the better the beginning. And then breaking down work into the smallest logical pieces allows for faster implementation, as I mentioned earlier, but also enables this team to respond more easily to changing requirements, which is a core tenet of Agile like we talked about before. And then as part of writing stories, engineers get to practice estimation, which should be a way to help determine how fast the team as a whole can ship. A synchronous review in a planning meeting, for example, is also a great opportunity for an engineer to seek out a second, third, or fourth set of eyes to give input on the rationale, details, and estimates before active development begins. And they have to be able to be vulnerable and understand that seeking that input, having empathy for others and their perspectives is really important. Then, after we've developed a feature, there's a part of our process where we're going to want to validate what we've built, right? And collect feedback from different audiences before a full feature is complete or after it's complete. And this could look different depending on the size of your company and the resources that you have available. It might be reaching out to other parts of the company, like marketing or sales, and asking for their feedback, or releasing a private beta to a group of loyal users. And this is another great opportunity for our engineers to get involved and lead the team. Our engineer might be reviewing feedback in written form, watching recorded user interviews, or even conducting them themselves, again, depending on the size of your team. All of these activities require empathy for the user, the ability to really put themselves in the user's shoes and understand their needs. And that requires an openness and ability to accept feedback about work that they're really invested in. They've spent time on it. They've worked closely with it. They've contributed their own ideas. And they might, at this phase, learn that the user has totally different expectations than anticipated and have to turn things around, change some ideas. And of course, we're going to return to our central theme of context sharing. This information is only valuable if that engineer can then take it back to the team and react to it in a useful way, whether that's making a small change or a larger pivot. And then one of my favorite and probably one of the most important aspects of Agile is the retrospective. This is the team's dedicated opportunity to reflect on a period of time or a whole project or whatever the scope you choose is, and give useful feedback that'll make the next project better. Iterative improvement is a key to having a really great team. A retrospective can provide a really useful and unique artifact that not only includes the reflections written by the entire team, but the action items that are documented by the facilitator. Often this will require some prompting from the group for actionable takeaways, and then they'll need to either follow up on them or ensure that someone else will for this feedback to be really valuable. And again, this is the time where maybe empathy is the most important. Retros need to be blameless with the understanding that everybody did the best they could and with the information that they had available. In order for teammates to feel comfortable sharing and responding to the feedback of others, they have to believe that their teammates and leaders have a sense of empathy. So, okay, well, maybe now you can see the many ways in which individual contributions to an Agile software development process can be aligned with specific leadership skills that are pretty desirable and not always easy to develop. And you might be wondering a variety of things at this point, including what's the best way for my team to make sure that everyone, or at least everyone who wants to, gets to participate in these activities. I've seen some different models at different companies that I work for, and each one has pros and cons, but can definitely give you a tangible framework for accomplishing your goals and setting folks up for success. One interesting process to follow is the concept of an Agile rotation, which is very much what it sounds like. In this model, a group of engineers, or maybe the entire team, depending on what kind of group you have, follows a rotation. Each engineer in this rotation takes on the role of Agile coach for the length of one iteration, whatever that means to you, a 1 or 2 week sprint, a 6-week delivery cycle, whatever unit the team uses that works best for them. And during this time, one single engineer acts as what you call the Agile coach. They engage in all the activities we've described up till now, including running the ceremonies like planning meetings and retrospectives, helping the product team with discovery, and documenting and planning work through design documents or stories in your project management tool of choice. There are a lot of upsides to this approach. Team members are very likely to develop empathy for the challenges that this work requires. It's not just one person doing it, everybody has to go through it at some point. This also distributes the work so it's not disproportionately resting on the shoulders of a single person, which is something I've seen on a lot of teams. The team also benefits from the unique skills and perspectives of different team members. While every engineer might be working toward honing the same leadership skills, each person will have a different approach and different strengths and weaknesses. The cons include things like the time it takes to ramp up for each iteration, getting a little bit of context, getting back into the swing of things, and the discomfort that comes with somewhat frequent transitions, both for the team and the person doing it. They become easier with time, but they do have a tangible cost. A second approach is having a couple of assigned roles on each team. Here, each group within your organization, maybe a team ranging in size for like 4 to 6, has 2 unique roles. One that focuses more on Agile processes and ceremonies, and then another for a specific engineer who's expected to dedicate a lot of their time to working with product owners, scoping work, doing discovery. In this model, our roles are longer lived. And again, there's no prescribed way to do this. It could be a quarter, a year, some undefined period of time, and can shift as folks decide if they do or don't like the role and how it impacts the way they spend their time. The Agile coach within the group is responsible for running ceremonies like planning and retrospectives, checking in on blockers, and keeping stories up to date and estimated, all those good skills that we talked about before. The engineer assigned to work with a product team might do discovery, produce design documents, conduct user interviews. The 2 roles collaborate a lot with one another and have some overlapping responsibilities. Again, pros and cons. Working to the team's advantage is the fact that there are less transitions and the engineers have time to settle into their particular roles. It also allows for people who don't want to engage in this type of work to more easily opt out. Conversely, the disadvantages are that the model can't provide opportunities for everyone if a lot of people are interested in doing it. It can also have a long-term impact on the time an engineer has to dedicate to active development. They'll be spending a lot of time engaged in these particular activities. Now, you also might be thinking, okay, I'm ready to run back to my team and make some proposals, or that all sounds great, but my company has things pretty rigid and I don't think I can negotiate about that. And so what we can do in this case is think back to what we reviewed, and if there's a skill you're looking to develop that ties into someone else's role, ask to shadow them or enter into a mentorship program if it's not that easy to just say, okay, we're going to follow this new practice now. Or just find ways to demonstrate your ability or ask your manager for ways that you can share context or document your work. Maybe that's leading an initiative like creating a better process for releases or outlining and advocating for better testing standards on your team or encouraging your team to produce more technical documentation like architecture diagrams. These are all specific activities that I've engaged in or seen other people engage in that have helped them be seen as leaders and led to the next steps in their career paths. And then you might also be wondering how you can influence change and help others progress if you are already in a leadership role. And that might not be a management role. It could be a tech lead role. It could be a more senior engineer. In all these cases, you have your social capital and you can use that to suggest new ideas and practices, whether they're things we've discussed or others that are formulating in your mind right now. And additionally, there's one skill in our empathy bucket that I didn't address until now, which is mentorship. If you feel comfortable with a leadership activity, bring someone else in and show them the ropes if you've been doing it for a while. And to touch on another point from the article I referenced before from John Alsbaugh, one of the most important things you can do when you have this social capital, when you're already in a leadership role, is to sponsor others. And what that means is to advocate for them. Allow them to take the lead on speccing out a project with your advice or oversight if it's needed, or ask them to run a meeting you might ordinarily be responsible for. Sponsorship, putting those people in the spotlight in those influential roles can go an incredibly long way. And for anyone who's ever heard me speak before, there's one thing I always mention. I encourage you to take whatever ideas I've shown you and make them your own. Take what works, throw away the rest. Every individual, every team is different. But what I do know for sure is if you communicate well, if you actively engage in planning, if you display empathy for your team, for your users, And if you focus on the product, you'll be seen as a leader. And that's what being senior is really all about. Thank you. Feel free to reach out with thoughts or questions if you had them, and enjoy the rest of the meetup.
Great, thank you, Nicole. We have a few minutes. Are there any questions that folks would like to address to Nicole about her talk? Somewhat quiet group tonight.
I have a question. It was something you mentioned early on, and you said you can still remember the first time you wrote tickets and kind of led an epic. I think I had a similar experience for my first time. And I was wondering if you had any advice for maybe some more junior folks about how could you prepare for that beforehand? Because I think I was kind of just thrown in, maybe you were just thrown in. Is there anything you could do to lead up to that to make that experience like a little more seamless?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, any context building that you can do, whether it's like in the code base or about the feature with the product and design teams, would be an important first step. I made a lot of assumptions when I did that from a product sense that I can now look back and think, oh gosh, that was not great. And then also, the other thing that I didn't do is I was trying to prove that I could do it. And so I didn't ask others to review my work. It wasn't so much, I wanted to be able to like take a first pass at it. And I would suggest that's probably a good way to go. But after that, I would have suggested to my former self, ask everybody to review your work, see what you came up with, and if it makes sense. And that way you can still get the experience of, kind of doing it on your own, seeing how it feels, and also making sure that you're setting yourself and the team up for success.
Cool, thanks.
Sure.
Nicole, a large percentage of our community are typically centered around early stage startups, the sub 10 people team size. When it comes to kind of this path of, career growth from a junior position into a senior role, sometimes that's maybe not something you can wait for in such a small team or such an early point in a company's life cycle. So do you have any insight for what, I don't know, maybe the founders that are on the meetup should look for when they're adding someone to their team that's going to be able to either shepherd this kind of process for their juniors?
So having been, I've been at a few early stage startups before. I think one of the things that's really good is for the, founder type folks is, having leaders on the team who are comfortable guiding others through a process, being a little bit more hands-on to help with those things, and also looking for folks on your team, especially if you kind of want to see that rapid career growth, which I can definitely say I had at Manifold. For people who are comfortable kind of exploring different areas and like stretching outside the bounds of their individual role. I know sometimes people who work at larger companies are like, this is exactly what I do and nothing more. Whereas kind of at startups, you have to be willing to be a little bit flexible. And that's the other thing too is, especially in a smaller company, it might happen such that, there isn't that other title available to you right now, or maybe at all. But as a company grows, it could become that way. And it's really good to also have that mindset of do the role before you have the role, hone the skills so that when the opportunity is there, that you're ready for it. And then conversely, from the leadership side or the founder side, being on the lookout for those different skills. So when you do have those things open up, being able to reward the folks on your teams who can do that sort of work.
Thanks. I think similarly, Katie asked in chat, well, what recommendations would you have for developers who want to develop and be engineering managers, or if that's another presentation?
I could definitely give a whole presentation on it, but I'd say the last thing I said was the most critical part for me when I transitioned from sort of individual contributor to engineering manager, which was, being okay with doing some things that were outside the bounds of what it meant to be an engineer on my team so that I could develop skills that I needed to feel comfortable interviewing for, or whether it be internally or externally, like a team lead or sort of like a more junior EM role. And then also talking with the leaders on your team, letting them know that you have that interest, whether again, it be like more senior engineers or your manager, so that they know they can give you these kinds of opportunities. And if they don't present that sort of thing to you, this is the kind of information that you can take and say like, hey, I'm looking to build my context sharing skills, or I'm looking to build out my ability to scope out work. Would it be okay with you if I shadowed so-and-so who's already doing it, or if I took a stab at doing it myself? And just being really proactive about it.
Another question from chat from Matthew is time or experience important in getting a senior role? Like how important is the actual time put in?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is different at a lot of companies, but I know from my perspective as an engineering manager, I definitely don't think that years of experience is the best indicator of the great leaders that you'll have on a team. I think, the most important thing is being willing to, to do those different activities, to be a good leader, to be a team player. And so that's, I mean, obviously, the more experience you have, I'd say almost all things in engineering, whether it be, being a senior engineer or being a manager, pattern matching helps. So the more time you have, the more likely you are to have seen a certain scenario. And so you'll feel more comfortable about what to do. But I would not say that years of experience or time in a role is the most important measure of leveling up.
Great.
I have a question.
Oh.
So it's purely based on my experience, right? Most of the organizations, or you can say the leaders, when they start transforming their projects from waterfall to agile, or they start, following that agile methodology, they start in a good way to move towards agile, but they end up actually being in a hybrid state or in like multiple smaller waterfalls into agile, and it's not actually an agile approach. So how can an engineer or a developer or a leader can avoid those kind of pitfalls? If you can share your experience on that. Yeah,
I would say two things. One is being as iterative as you can be. Just like with writing code, it's really easy to get very invested in your ideas. I've put together this process and it's perfect and I never want to change it. Avoiding that mindset as best as you can. Obviously, it's a human thing. And being open to feedback from folks is really important. So I always encourage my teams, like, try things, but also if they aren't working, I will hear you and look to change it. So I think one of those things is just always having an eye on, what can we do better? What's going to serve us better? And the other thing is, from the individual contributor's perspective, when you see something that's not working or something that's kind of trending in the direction that either you didn't expect or isn't true to what you believe should be happening, when you can, and this won't always be the case, come with a solution or a proposal. It's a lot easier for somebody who is in a position to change a process to say like, wow, you've really put a lot of thought into this. Like, you have a better idea than I do. I'm happy to go ahead and implement that, than they are to, say here, okay, there's a problem, but now what do we do to solve it? And then the other thing you can offer to do is like workshop through it with them if you don't have, a really great idea right off the bat.
thank you.
Great. So we're a bit over. I'm going to shorten the break. So let's take 6 minutes. Let's go clean to 7:45, and we'll come back for Tyler's talk. I'm not going to put up the slides. I'm not going to play janky elevator music. Feel free to use this time to socialize with anybody here. But thank you very much to Nicole for this great talk.
Thank you. Also, I'm in the Slack if anybody wants to chat that way.
Yeah, I just had a question for you, Nicole.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, so I'm gonna put it out there. I'm a beginner to software development. I want to get into it. I'm in school currently. Um, I just wanted to know if you had any cool tricks or hacks on, if you struggle with solving a problem, especially in the workspace. Like I'm just thinking, what if you're assigned something that you really don't have the ability to do? What kind of advice would you give somebody?
Yeah, I think that there is a great balance to be had between going out and trying to find the solution on your own and not beating your head against the wall at the expense of your own sanity and also the team's velocity, right? The approach that I always took, especially when I was earlier in my career, but still now, is I would always take some amount of time, and you can time box if you find that to be helpful, to try to find the solution on my own, whether that be Googling or digging through the code base or whatever it is, looking through historical documents to try to figure out why certain decisions were made. And then if I still couldn't do whatever it was, in the case that I was talking about in my talk was like scoping out this project, being able to come with like an informed set of questions to show that you've thought about it. I know it sounds really straightforward, but if you've put enough time and investment into the problem, you've also probably made some headway into the solution, and you just can't, totally get there yourself. But you're showing your coworkers, your manager, whoever you're coming to, that you've put in a lot of intentional thought, and that you're interested in the solution. And then those folks, if you have a good team, should be willing to help you.
Cool, thank you. Just one other thing that popped up in my mind when you were giving your speech, or your talk rather, is I'm kind of new to project management too, and I've watched a couple videos on YouTube on it, and I just was wondering, in your opinion, do you approach most tasks that are assigned to you in your workspace with a project management tool so that you can kind of fit some of those requirements of documenting and making a plan? Or is there sometimes when you're assigned stuff, you find that it's not necessary to go that in depth?
Yeah, I try to, I have maybe sort of a biased manager's perspective now, but I guess maybe that's also valuable to have, which is, from the leadership perspective on a team, it's always better to have more documentation than less, whether that means about the feature itself or like why certain decisions were made. So I always tend toward documenting my work like in a project management way or otherwise, like whenever I can. And I think that's a good approach to take. I don't think any good manager would ever fault you for making that effort. One of the tenets that we have followed at various teams that I've worked on, partially because we're remote, but just partially because communication is important in general, is over communicate. And I'd say that falls into that bucket too, is like document everything you can, because again, it shows a lot of good thought. And the other thing is it forces you to think through things in a really intentional way, which can help you approach your work with a little bit more clarity.
I had a question about your retrospective practices. How do you close that accountability loop from things that come out of retrospectives, and how do you prioritize? Like, you always generate more things that you're going to get done when you run them. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I'd say things fall into 3 buckets, and there's one that should be avoided when it can be. One is really nebulous ideas, like we should, I don't know, I can't think of a great example, but like something that nobody can own and nobody can document, right? Those things that are really hard to be usefully taken out of retrospective. Other things, assigning owners to particular things, whether it be like a new practice or whatever it is really great. And then the third bucket are like work that you can track in your project management tool of choice. And that helps with accountability. And then the other thing I've done that's really useful, and I'll stop talking because I know we have somebody else coming up, is to check in on those at the next retro. What did we say we were going to do last time, and did we do it? Again, if anybody wants to chat more, I will keep my eye on Slack, but I will stop talking now. Thank you for all the really great questions.